So Alexander Schallenberg, I guess he's the chancellor of Austria. And if people haven't heard what's going on in Austria right now, starting last week of November 22nd, people cannot leave their homes if they have not been administered the prick. So, and I guess that's the word we're going to use. So, Robert, I'm reading your piece here on Strategic Culture Foundation. What's going on with that? Does that sound remotely like sound policy? Is there pushback from this? What's the angle?
That's a good question, Joaquin. And actually, this lockdown, it applies not only to people who have not been vaccinated, but also to the vaccinated, which is really strange because these people are supposed to be protected, which are obviously not. The vaccines are showing that whether or not you get them, I mean, when you get them, you're still able to transmit the disease, you're still able to catch it. So, in terms of whether or not this is legal, that's really hard to say. The International Court of Law would say no. Historical precedents would say no. If you look at the Nuremberg codes, for example, which I guess we can get into a bit later, but this whole notion we've entered a very fuzzy zone of what is legal and what is not based upon a medical emergency, where basically anything seems to fly because people are getting sick, grandma's dying, therefore we have to lock down everybody, lock down the whole system, which just seems utterly insane.
Oh yeah, and I
So
mean,
I don't see where it's going from here.
well, yeah. Well, the one thing is, Robert, I don't think we should get too trapped in. I understand about legality, but we have to also remember that there's the cliche that slavery used to be legal, and I'm going to make up a new cliche. In ancient Mexico, human sacrifice used to be legal. I actually just
Oh, there
got
we
off
go.
watching a very interesting documentary about the history of human sacrifice in Mexico. Very, very interesting before this conversation. So, one thing about this is it legal or is it illegal? There's also always ways to sort of dance around that. And I think even in your article, you sort of mentioned how even in the, what is it, the preface to this move by the Austrians, they say that, it's everyone's individual choice to do what they want, but then the law just forces you to do what they want. You see what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And well, for example, getting into, for example, international law and precedent that has been set down, you have the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which stipulates that in no case should a collective community agreement or the consent of a community leader substitute for an individual's informed consent. That's like clause one of this declaration. So here you have a government, just because there's been a spike in this disease, and they're saying that hospitals are being overrun, crowded, whatnot. That they can pretty much do whatever they want, keep the people locked down, absolutely destroy businesses. How many small businesses are going to be able to survive? Because they just renewed this lockdown. It's going to go until December 11th now. It's going into the second week. How many small businesses are going to be able to survive this? How many people, to speak nothing of their mental state, to be locked up like this? It's really a humanitarian disaster, I think, and on so many levels. And the fact that they're able to get away with this. And what's really disturbing was the media. The media just completely embraced this whole thing. Instead of questioning the move, which is they came out with headlines that read, for example, Euronews. I'll have to consult my notes here.
Mm-hmm.
Euronews came out with a headline that said, just very blasé, nonchalantly said that Austria is the first European nation to adopt mandatory lockdowns,
Mm-hmm.
mandatory lockdowns and mandatory vaccinations. Very blasé, as if this is just a normal thing. This is just the first step. Everything's fine. The journalists are not doing their job. They're not questioning, is this even legal? Is this morally acceptable? They're just going along with it.
I could kind of suppose that many of them don't really understand that concept. As someone who's worked in the media, I can tell you that this is a bit of an aside, but hey, let's go on a little bit of an aside here. One of the main problems with the media is it sort of reflects the people who make it. And generally, you're looking at someone who is a 20 to 30 year old, 20 to 40 year old, urbanite, unmarried type of person, generally liberal, and they tend not to think in those terms. You see what I mean? I think that
Mm-hmm.
is a lot of the sort of stereotypical modern journalist, if that's kind of almost in a way it's kind of a paradox, but the modern journalist of today, they really don't think of things in those terms. Or do you think I'm missing something, Joaquin? Am I jumping off the bridge here?
Uh, you're not jumping off the bridge. I would just say that look, these are instructions. This is a cultural problem. This goes beyond the socioeconomic or cultural position of a handful of journalists. It goes deeper into these institutions, but it just shows. I think it's. I'm curious what Robert thinks really, but there's really just been a very slow creep coup against democracy, against constitutional republican norms in society, and corporations, which have always been part of modern Western society. Their power has just grown so much that they actually just overtly dictate policy more than we've ever seen before. It's not a new thing, but it's out of hand.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you, Joaquin. It is we've let these corporations get so much power, so much influence in the political realm, that the very notion of representation for the people, it's a joke to even talk about it. When you're looking at the amount of money that a company like Pfizer, Moderna, all these other ones can pump into the political system to get their way. I mean, who knows what's going on too behind the doors? How much money is? Although I think that's been exposed in some areas, that just the amount of money that they're able to throw at these politicians in terms of lobbying, many other ways. It's fighting an uphill battle, really.
Mm.
So yeah, definitely the corporations need to be restrained. And you hate to toss around the F word too much, not that F word, but the fascist word, because really, what is this? This is nothing more than the marriage, the black marriage between corporations and the government. That's exactly what we've got going on here. So they can just dictate to governments, and I think that's what's happening. They're dictating to government. This whole thing, it's so coordinated across the globe. How does that happen? How does such a concerted message and response to an emergency happen like that? How does every single country act almost in exactly the same way?
And
That's
Robert,
that's
I have something to add to what you're saying here, and I think the one thing we're missing is that during this crisis, right? As someone, a lot of us are sort of between two countries. Joaquin's between Serbia and America, and you and I are sort of between Russia and America and our mentality. So I can say that I noticed in America that certain groups, the type of people who say that the U.S. government is inherently racist, it's an evil patriarchy, it's repressive, it is the ultimate evil. Those type of liberals. And their Russian equivalents who say that, Putin has to go and that everything in Russia is bad and so on and so forth. Both of those types of people who believe that both of these governments are inherently evil for slightly different reasons immediately jumped in lockstep to obey everything related to these mandates. I think that that's one of the most intellectually interesting things about this whole event. I mean, didn't you see it? The same people are like, the government is an evil patriarchy. They're the slave masters of our time. Oh, sit at home and get pricked and all this stuff? Sure. 100%, no problem. We'll do it.
I mean, you're fighting against something too that's invisible. It's one of the scariest things imaginable. And a virus that you could catch and end up in the hospital. It's so easy to play up that threat and really scare people with it. It's a terrifying notion. So they can just run with that narrative as much as they want, and they have. And the youth, many kids, young people are terrified of it, and rightly so. But when you look at the statistics, when you get down to the nitty gritty of the details, who's actually suffering from this the most? It's older people, it's people with comorbidities, cancer, whatever, health problems, diabetes. These are the people who are actually dying from this. So the whole idea of saying we're going to lock down your entire society because of something that kills less than 1% of the population. It just doesn't fly in the face of logic. And but we've become so, the media has just taken over the whole narrative, and you're not allowed to have a counter opinion. I guess we could talk about that a little bit later, but there is no counter narrative. There is no medical second opinion. If you're a physician, you're kicked out of the entire conversation right from the start. If you try to suggest that there's an alternative like ivermectin, Joe Rogan tried to go with the ivermectin, and he just got attacked. Aaron Rodgers, the football player. God forbid if somebody suggests a different method of combating this pandemic. It's just unheard of.
And I can tell you from, I guess, a bit of a personal anecdote here that the doctors that I see, the family doctors that we've been using for years, publicly, they have to say one thing. What they'll tell you to do over the telephone is completely the opposite. But then again, that's more Russian mentality of how to do things. But yeah, even here, where in Russia, we definitely have a lot more freedom to usually argue about stuff. I'll put it this way, at least in Russia, the argument exists. There's still somewhat of a culture of fear. It really seems like with this particular event, all the paid for goons and globalists have really kind of come out of the woodworks. But the question is, again, why now? I think that's something, Joaquin, you could probably answer. Why is this happening now?
Probably 2015, 2017. There was a lot of news reportage about how the next war would be a biological war, and also saying this was mainstream news stuff. You can see it in Washington Post, Australian mainstream news, and they were talking about that. And such a war might target populations based upon like their phenotype, right? Like they're kind of like their race in a sense, and to the extent that that exists, right? So what we're seeing, and it's crazy to me, Robert. Like when you talk about, we're talking about quarantine facilities that kind of, for all intents and purposes, are like concentration camps. Talking about supply line shortages. Talking about internal checkpoints, it very much feels like the world's at war.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Well, when you look at the WEF, the Davos Agenda of you'll owe nothing and be very happy. And it looks like we're steamrolling towards that future, and it looks too I don't know, too convenient to just be considered a coincidence. Like you mentioned, you've got the supply shortages. They're blaming it on all sorts of things. You can blame everything on COVID, whatever. But let's face it, there are cargo ships backed up. There's so many actually that they have to put them far out so that people don't even see them. They're afraid that. It's a political thing, of course. Biden, what else did he cut off the Keystone oil pipeline that could have freed up, aside from the environment, and it would have freed up the American economy. It would have created jobs. It would have stopped wars in the Middle East. It would have done so much. So yeah, when you look at all these things taken together as a whole, it looks like there is a concerted effort on the part of whoever to just really destroy human independence, self-sustenance, and make everybody just completely under the thumb, under the rule of the government. And it's, I don't know, whether they're heading towards probably a universal pay. And I think next year it's going to be really, I don't know, I hate to be a gloom and doomist, but it's not looking good for next year. I think we're going to see a lot of, maybe even this winter, we're going to see a lot of these things come out and play. I don't think people are understanding the dire situation with regards to the food shortages, for example. So all these things taken together, it looks like it's almost impossible to say that this is just a coincidence. Climate change and everything. A lot more is going to be happening with the climate, apparently, blaming a lot more on the climate. That we might even have lockdowns, for God's sakes, due to the climate. People will have to stop driving their cars. The whole notion of people buying things in the future, it's going to be a service economy where you no longer buy a house, you probably are going to rent it. You're not going to own a car, you're going to lease it. Or if there's even such a thing as cars in the future. Everything is going to be like it seems like they want to squeeze people out of the farming idea, out of communities, out of the suburbs, bring the urban area to the suburbs and vice versa, destroy that notion, make people completely dependent upon corporations and the pharmaceuticals. Because if this whole thing continues the way it is with boosters and everything, I mean, what some doctors are saying is that you keep taking these boosters, and this I'm not an anti-vaxxer. First of all, vaccines are great, blah blah blah. They've done a lot for humanity. They've killed smallpox and et cetera, et cetera. But this particular variety is it's a kind of a strange vaccine in that you don't just get it once, you get it twice, and you get it 3 times, and then you have to get a booster. And there are doctors out there that are saying that these boosters, for example, it's destroying the immune system, our natural ability to fight off these diseases. Mm-hmm. So that's another aspect of it. How long can humans survive in such a thing, and will we be able to participate if we get locked into this whole idea of the vaccine mandates and everything? And I think this is the scary road here, is that everything is locked into your smartphone, apps. Okay, do you have your vaccine or not? Yes, okay, then you can come into our store. Thank you, buy whatever you want. If you don't, if you decide to skip your last, I don't know, 10th booster and you can't get into a store, then your whole survival is on the line. And they can cut off your credit. They can, I mean, who knows what they could do? It's a whole system, looks like geared towards the Chinese credit system, where they can just make you a non-entity. They can make you not be able to fly, not be able to board public transport. So once the whole thing goes to that direction, and currency, our cash currency, that's why I think personally that everybody should just throw away their smartphones. I don't think it would make a difference in the long run, but I think as a first step, get rid of your smartphone. I mean, I can't personally, I say that, but I can't myself do it. I have to have it. But in terms of carrying it around everywhere you go, I think people should go back to just a basic telephone, stop being dependent on the smartphones, stop downloading all these apps that they require us to download. So,
well, yeah, so I think when you, let me ask, because I've seen that there's been some pushback in Austria. There's been protests. But are there political solutions to this? Is that possible? I mean, I know, for example, we have electronic voting systems. They're used in a lot of countries now. It makes it a little bit more problematic, if you know what I mean. Uh-huh. But are there solutions? When I looked at your piece, I did some reading earlier today, and looking at the Austrian government, and they're blaming, because they have apparently a very low vaccination rate, something like 61%, they claim. Uh-huh. And if I'll just say, if we include the Event 201 dry run that was done several years ago in the fall, right, of 2019, they included in that a sense of how can we inflate numbers of people involved in our program so that it creates that feeling that everyone's done it. So if Austria is reporting 60%, maybe that's, I mean, some might say, we have to be careful how we word this, but some might say that's 25% or 30%. And so they have a low rate by their own admission, regardless, Robert. But mm-hmm. Does that mean that is that because people are informed? The government is blaming fake news. They're blaming anti-vaxxers, whatever that means, for this vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, I just looked into the whole question of, I couldn't even find any news about protests. Before we sat down here for this talk, I was looking through Google, which is just a joke these days, trying to find any news at all about protests there. And apparently there was a huge protest just yesterday. The Freedom Party of Austria, they organized this general strike. Thousands of people were on the streets. Good luck trying to find any news about that. I went through every English language Austrian paper, the local, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody mentioned those protests at all. Complete blackout of that information. So that's the first step. You talk about fake news. I mean, there you go. It's not necessarily fake news. It's just not reporting the news. and that's what people need to hear before they can. And the question about, is there a political solution? It's so funny that when you do read about this, they blame the right all the time. This is like some kind of xenophobic, nationalistic response. Anybody who's an anti-vaxxer is a Trumpian, for example, or they're from the far right. They're xenophobic. I mean, you get the idea. And that's not true. You go in all these different protests. They've interviewed, many people. And these are people, even people who have been vaccinated. They're out on the streets protesting against this. They don't like what they're seeing. They made a decision to get the vaccine. Okay, fine. But why do they have to? Why are they demanding that everybody get it? 60%. If that's really true, that 60% of Austrians have been vaccinated. To me, I mean, I'm no doctor, but that sounds like a lot of people to be vaccinated. And you got to sooner or later be approaching herd immunity, natural immunity. When does that kick in? Why is nobody talking about that aspect of it? That sooner or later that has to kick in, right? And you can't even have that conversation anymore. It's like herd immunity never existed for the past 2 million years. We're here today because of it. Our bodies naturally fought off the virus, many millions of viruses. We face viruses every day, not just the coronavirus. So in order to get, and I guess that might be a good way to lead into the whole idea of the Nuremberg Code, is that it says that, and I can quote it to you here, just a piece of it. I won't bore you with the whole thing, but it says,
Robert, before you get into that, could you tell us a bit about what is the background? What is this Nuremberg Code? What is that?
Okay, well, that was the war trial. It was held in, I believe, Brussels. And it was the one that I'm referring to it was called the doctor's trial, and this was against the doctors who participated in these horrific medical experiments against people who were held in the concentration camps, citizens of different countries, and it was held in 1947. So it was kind of this doctor's trial was separate from the actual Nuremberg trials, but it was all under the same thing, the Nuremberg codes. So the very first recommendation, I guess you call it a recommendation, and these things, of course, they're not enforceable by law, but this is what sent all these doctors to their death. Not all of them, but some of them to jail, some of them executed for what they did to people. And the very first one says, and I quote, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the subject matter involved so as to make an enlightened decision." Now, I don't know. To me, that sounds like, I don't know what that sounds like to you, but that sounds like what we're doing right now, what's happening in Austria. That's a clear violation of the Nuremberg, of this doctor's trial, the findings from that. The people are not able to make a decision by themselves. They're not making a decision that's based on informed consent, because they're not letting other doctors participate in this debate, in this discussion. They're saying, no, we know the best answer. We have the best science. Dr. Fauci is the god of the medical world. We don't need to hear from anybody else. And that's just crazy. That's not how science and medicine has evolved over the years. It's evolved through trial and error. I mean, if we were never allowed to question anybody, we'd still be, I don't know, bloodletting people for headaches.
So I would imagine that a real bad thing for the stock market in a lot of ways would be war of any kind, where investments might be threatened, especially with global supply chains. So if there was going to be a war, or if there was actually some kind of war, like an economic war going on, I suppose like a mass mystery illness with no end in sight would be a real good cover for that. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but when you look at all these governments around the world that are on board with this, and certainly the IMF has put a lot of coercion on them. We get that, Robert, and you've mentioned this before at work. But when we think about this question of war and government policy, I wonder if behind all of this, they're saying things like, it's important for us to test these systems in place in the event of a biological war so that we have experience with this. The population is used to this. Now, you've mentioned, of course, a lot of things about where this is leading in terms of the Great Reset, in terms of, Green Pass and COVID passes and basically digital currencies and stuff like this. But there's something going on geopolitically in the world with the rise of China, with supply line security, and there seems to be so much focus on Australia and New Zealand as a focus of these most draconian measures, and I can't help but noticing that they're very, very hard, for, let's say, NATO or for the West, for the Anglo 5 militaries to defend that area. It just raises a lot of questions. Where are you at in your head with this?
Wow. To be quite honest, I haven't given enough thought to that aspect of it in terms of war and everything. In terms of biological, they could be that could be a method of getting countries on board, saying we have to have this system in place. And we saw, like as you mentioned, with that event 201, they predicted something that basically happened 2 months later. So you have that aspect of it that's extremely suspicious. I mean, predicting it right down to the T, exactly what happened with the shutdown of the economy and everything. So
well, one thing, Robert, then what was the end game of that event 201? So we've talked about this, and I've heard about it from many people that it was a simulation. Well, how did that simulation end? Do you know?
Well, I'll tell you what, Tim. I wrote about that actually for Strategic and Strategic Culture Foundation, and it's amazing. I mean, it is absolutely amazing. They had fake. I mean, this is just one aspect of it to give you a brief. They actually brought in a fake. They had a fake news channel with a Chinese broadcaster. Oh, that's irrelevant. But talking about what's happening in the world, interviewing fictional heads of business. For example, an airline, they had a guy who played the part of an airline, and he was saying that we're going to have to close down airlines. There's going to be a lockdown. Flights aren't going to be able to leave. It's going to have a huge impact on the airline industry. Government's going to have to intervene. And then they had an economist who was playing the bad guy, saying we can't do this. We can't lock down just because of a virus. I mean, it's unbelievable. The whole thing, every single aspect of that event, it actually was so spot on that Johns Hopkins University, which was one of the participants in this, they actually came out with a statement saying that they had no knowledge of any they were not, this was not a predictive event, so to speak. They had to come out with some kind of disclaimer, because there's so many people questioning this. Like, how in the heck, two months before this very same thing breaks out, you're having this like fake. I mean, it's, of course you have to prepare for things, but it was just so unbelievably spot on that it raised a lot of questions. That it's something to really look into. Like, you could probably still catch it somewhere on YouTube, I guess, if it's still available.
Well, that's almost like this might seem like a silly thing to bring up, but you'll notice when like high schoolers do those model UNs, that when even given the high school students, basically the circumstances of being in charge of some sort of poor, very oppressed, possibly partially colonized African country, and then being in power in the United States, a lot of times even high school kids will repeat very realistic sort of formulas and behave in a very realistic manner because the circumstances sort of dictate it. So in a way, I see what you mean about it being very predictive and almost in a scary way, but it's sort of like, it's like that popular series with our liberal friends that, what is it, Handmaid's Tale? So if we look at this sort of anti-motherhood, anti-breeding propaganda piece called the Handmaid's Tale there. Within that, it's very interesting because they paint this picture of this dark universe where women are forced to have children because only a very small percent of the population can actually give birth or something. That's the way I understand it. It's male repression, patriarchy. But when you create a very sort of this situation where there's really only one way out of it, and then that way out of it is something that sounds bad, well, it's predictive. That's exactly what would be. And I think that maybe with Event 201, it's very much that, like, how else could people react to a global pandemic? Like you mentioned, this economist said we have to keep things open because we have to keep the economy afloat. Well, I think that that's a very natural thing to be said by someone who understands that really countries stand on their economy. You know what I mean? Versus some sort of housewife who's going to think from the perspective of, like, I've got to protect me, I've got to protect my kids. Sure, do whatever you need to. Let's be locked down. Vaccinate my kids. I just want to be safe. So in a lot of ways, the predictiveness of Event 201, I don't think justifies that it's maybe part of, how do I put this? It's not particularly predictive, but it definitely shows something about the natural reactions of people to a given crisis, if that makes sense, I would hope.
Yeah, it makes sense. And well, that's the thing you've got going on here is that it's the scariest thing, like I said before, to imagine that there's something you can't even see, and people are willing to wear masks everywhere they go, and other human beings are actually a threat to them now. They have to keep their distance from everybody. So you can really play this up, this fear factor with this. So they could really, you could run with this narrative, and I think that the response has just been overwhelmingly a bad one in terms of the economic destruction. Yeah, I see what you're saying, Tim. There are people who take the medical side of it, that we have to protect everybody. We can't let grandma die and everybody. But now it's gotten on to such a point that the level of suicides, for example, domestic abuse, alcoholism, all these other things, unemployment, you got to start weighing the pros and the cons of this. Mm-hmm. And I think the cons are starting to win out heavily. You can only lock people down for so long before it's just impossible. You can't have a global economy running under such conditions. It's just it's going to break.
You bring up a very good point. So on the one hand, right, a lot of people would blame the globalist mentality for this sort of crisis. Not that they necessarily created it or something, but generally the people who are sort of that pro-globalist are also the people who are sort of this pro, everyone, get the prick, everyone do this, everyone submit, and all that. But on the other hand, what's happening right now is the world is becoming divided again, in some ways almost like the Cold War. So I don't quite understand it, because it seems like forcing the world to be divided, which then allows capitalism to adapt to these new circumstances, is almost reversing globalism. So is this event pro-globalist, anti-globalist? What's going on with that?
It's definitely, it goes against globalization, right? But globalization was supposed to have certain promises, right? So, call me an optimist, but I see a lot of this as being a huge sign of institutional weakness on the part of the banks behind the IMF, which have basically staged all of this. I mean, the role of the World Health Organization and Bill Gates and his philanthropy are almost secondary. I think the real thing to focus on is the World Economic Forum, is the IMF, is Klaus Schwab, and why they, this really is what you're saying, Tim and Robert. It goes against trade. They know this. It's not like, we have to stay away from this liberal approach to criticism, which really flatters the audience, right? Because it's like, yeah, the people in charge are idiots. They don't know what they're doing, but they do know what they're doing. They get some things wrong along the way, and we can push back, I think. But they know what they're doing. They know that this slows down global trade. So why are they trying to slow down global trade? And is this related to some sort of strategic advantage vis-a-vis China? Or is it because global supply chains cannot be defended militarily or are not economical in terms of the debt to GDP ratios that all of these countries are maintaining? I mean, if you have to borrow money to have banking so that you have loans so that people buy things, then what are you really doing? So then it looks to me like the problem is the population itself. Maybe the population is just too high if you just have a bunch of useless eaters, in the words of Henry Kissinger, who was the mentor, one of the mentors of Klaus Schwab. So these are the things that sort of, jump out to me. But
then again, Joaquin, that always jumps back to this conversation we've kind of had before, but bears a lot of repeating, is that overall, really all you need to do for population control is just be liberal. Because once liberalism hits and everyone has to have both parents go work in an office, everyone has 1 or 2 kids or 0. Or they don't get married at all. So in a lot of ways, I don't know. I'm always very skeptical of this thing where there's this belief that we have to just lower the population right now. It has to be done right now. I don't think that that's particularly necessary. And everything that's happened over the last few generations, sort of going from World War II through the sexual revolution to today, has really accomplished the mission of making human relationships not work. And when human relationships don't work, there's no kids. So I don't know. I'm not super sure about the whole eaters factor. Robert, where do you weigh in on this?
I think that's a very good point, which you made, Tim, about liberalism. The whole agenda itself is just geared towards. Well, we don't have to get into all the details, but you can only have LGBTQ and all that for so long before population does automatically decline. Yeah, I don't see how what I'm looking at is that maybe a lot of these countries feel like, Joaquin, I know that you've written a lot about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and all this, and in a very well-reasoned manner. And when you look at that, I start to think that maybe the countries feel that they just can't be left behind in this. And getting to the useless eaters idea, perhaps they understand that in 5 years, I mean, already you can go into a store in the suburbs of Moscow. You don't need to go to a cashier. You could take care of everything yourself, check yourself through with your product. So these types of low-level service jobs, they're just not going to be there in the future. So that's one aspect. I mean, that's a huge, and even teaching, this is one aspect that we're looking at here as parents. It looks like the way things are evolving, that they're going to want to basically do away with schools and teachers, the whole traditional school altogether. It looks like they want kids to just learn from home and through basically these AI systems. And that's the trajectory that we see it heading in, my wife and I, and we're obviously against that. I think there's nothing better than a child going off to school in the morning and participating, sitting through a class. But this is the type of future I think we're facing, where even teachers, doctors, surgeons, I mean, everything, we don't really even have any idea how advanced technology is. It could be at the state now. I mean, there are already robots that can perform brain surgery, for example. I mean, who knows? In 20 years, it's almost impossible to imagine. So they're looking in their crystal ball 25 years down the road, I guess, and they're seeing that there's just not going to be a need. And if I'm thinking the way they're thinking, that there's not going to be a need for so many people. So why do we need to have them on the planet? So you look at it that way, then, but still, I don't think any of that justifies the way that they're handling this particular so-called emergency. It seems like a real underhanded method for doing lots of things, putting people on just getting people onto these vaccines forever, putting people on in their smartphones. Everything you do has to be traced, getting people onto a digital currency where everybody will be absolutely controlled then. With a flick of a switch, you're off of the grid. So those types of things are very worrisome to me.
Well, yeah, that's actually something that's going to happen, or probably going to happen in Russia. Is they're going to the central bank here, which, as you know, is much like the Fed. They want to release almost like a crypto ruble, a digital ruble, as it's going to be called, and it's going to sort of work like crypto, But you kind of have to be concerned about the people who want to release it. And of course, the usual promises are the advantage is that essentially your money would be always your money, and you could switch between different banks or not use a bank or whatever, which of course the banks in Russia are not happy about because it essentially creates a system where you don't really need the bank anymore as this mechanism to store your money. Which is kind of interesting. But on the other hand, it really means that it's going to be very traceable, because how Bitcoin stands on this ledger system. It's going to be very traceable as to every financial operation you've ever made. And that could prove to be quite a pain in the butt. And again, when it goes back to a private central bank being the ones who are going to control that knowledge, that seems a little bit dangerous, at least from where I'm sitting. So yeah, essentially, society is somewhat being remade very poorly right now. It seems in a lot of ways, when we look back 100 years ago, the future was bright and gleaming and chrome, and man is going to go to space. We're going to do all this, and I think for people alive today, when we look at maybe like near futurism, near future view of like science fiction, everything sucks. I think that's something that's very something. Another thing we haven't really embraced is that the near future looks like garbage. Now, one thing going back to your point about humans not being needed, I just wanted to jump in with this one kind of little talking point here. Is that I would really recommend that everyone watches some of the debunking videos on YouTube that are regarding Elon Musk, because Elon Musk makes huge promises. Those huge promises go to the media. They shape this picture of this humanless near future. He doesn't deliver on any of it. Like, literally, the Tesla cars that he makes are still made by hand, mostly. So, in a lot of ways, I think there's sort of this, yes, you can get a car to drive by itself, but it's already been like 10 years. Where are these driving cars? Well, it's like, well, under ideal conditions and this, that, and the other. Well, we could travel, do all this like transport by rockets, this Hyperloop thing he's come up with, all these other sort of futuristic technologies. They sort of are possible, and yet they're not. The perfect one, the 3D printed house. The 3D printed house is supposed to be the death blow to all of us troglodytes who've ever worked with our hands. 3D printed houses, you kind of just make the walls, and then everything else in the house has to be installed manually, because that's how houses are. There is no 3D printed house. There are 3D printed concrete walls that if the system, the printer, is even slightly off by, I think it's like 1 degree, the house sort of collapses. It can't, they can't finish printing. And all that materials are wasted. They would have to be removed by some sort of, excavator or something. What I'm trying to say here is that all of these near future technologies are overblown. And there's a reason why these same near future technologies have been repeated over and over and over again since about 2010. So again, 3D printed houses are a lie. A lot of the autonomous driving that's supposed to eliminate drivers is only under these sort of ideal factory conditions and doesn't really work. So that's something we really can't forget about, is that the future may actually not be as humanless as they try to portray it.
Maybe you can explain to me, Tim, how is it possible that Elon Musk can promise to get us to Mars, but yet NASA apparently has lost the technology to get us back to the moon?
Well, you could also, well, Robert, I could argue from their standpoint that there's sort of no reason to go to the moon. They've been there a few times. They've gotten their samples. There's sort of nothing to do with it. The real holdup is that apparently, like a big ecosystem like our planet, right? It's so big that when something weird happens, the rest of it sort of compensates for that. And at least from what I understand from watching fantastic documentary movies, is that creating a little ecosystem, like with the size of, an apartment building that the astronauts would live in when they try to colonize the moon, is if one thing goes wrong, that ecosystem collapses and everyone dies. And that's really the hard part about what they're trying to do. So essentially, throwing people on the moon or Mars isn't that hard. It's creating this sort of long-term temporary ecosystem that's sort of self-contained. That's the real kicker. And all of these sort of like remembering back to the 90s, the movie Biodome. Oh boy, there we go, Pauly Shore. This sort of attempts to make these biodomes across different countries, and simulations of what life like would be on Mars. None of them have succeeded. None. You see what I mean? So that's kind of what's the problem. But again, is technology in some ways going in the wrong way? I think that's what your overall question is.
I would have to say absolutely.
Yeah.
I grew up in Pittsburgh, and right down the road from where I went to the University of Pittsburgh was Carnegie Mellon University, and they were like at the one of the leaders of AI technology, robotics, and everything. And I always had this gut feeling that this was going to blow up in our faces. They always sell the idea of robots as being these domestic friendly little machines that help us in the kitchen and make our espresso for us and everything else, blah, blah, blah. But speaking about humans and the future of the human race and whether or not they want less humans or not, I think the question now is what will humanity even look like? Because now we're approaching this idea of transhumanism, which I unfortunately don't know that much about, but I know the basics, that they want to, basically connect the human mind with that of a computer, where we're no longer even humans, we're some kind of hybrid robot, somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. So how much they want to go ahead with that and just do away with humans altogether and make some sort of species of robots, I don't know. And maybe the elite will sit at the top of this all, and they'll be the natural humans.
Well, Jeff Bezos recently said, and so first of all, it's crazy. Let me just say, it's crazy that we focus on, well, what did David Rothschild say? What did Jeff Bezos say? What did Bill Gates say? What does Elon Musk think? We don't even talk anymore about what did President so-and-so say or whatever, because these people just don't matter in the Western world, right? Who runs the show are these oligarchs, the big super elites, right? Patrick Byrne recently said that this is a war between the super elites versus the regular elites joined with everyone else, with regular elites, right? So when we look at these oligarchs who are running the show in the West, it's a huge problem, suffice it to say. So now we look at what Jeff Bezos says, and he says, because this is basically what they think is going to happen, says he sees a near future where the Earth is just a playground for some people who are allowed to go there, and that most people will live and work in near Earth orbit, or in space, as they like to call it. Mm-hmm. And he said that will be millions of people in space. So then I just do that. I mean, I'm not a mathematician or anything, but if most people equals millions, mm-hmm. You follow what I'm saying? Yeah. That's a projection about human population, mm-hmm. that they want to see happen. When you look at Elon Musk, right, he's actually got a theosophy or a theology, if you will, because he acknowledges what is becoming a mainstream view in theoretical physics, right, which is that this universe is created, right, that it is a simulation. He thinks in terms of computers because he's of that generation, but he's sort of on the cusp between, I guess he's Generation X through and through, but he's definitely of that generation that's, cyberpunk influence. Mm-hmm. So kind of like the Matrix, right? Yeah. So he basically says that this reality is the Matrix. Now, Tim, for youngsters like you, I think you're a millennium, aren't you? You're a millennial.
1981 was when I was born.
Yeah, you're a millennial, bro. Oh. So, when you
I hate
and Robert's like, my kids are millennials. Yeah. So, when we think about it like this, he's saying that this is a constructed universe, but that rather than drawing the conclusion that means that it had a race of intelligent designers, and that our souls that the existence of our existence that is on their radar, and that there's some interaction. No, that he ignores that part. There's some kind of dark nihilism, like they've constructed this virtual reality, they're ignoring it, they're ignoring the simulation, and that then we have to create a virtual reality inside the virtual reality to upload our consciousnesses into, so that we can live forever. That's what he's talking about.
Sounds like a good excuse to create transhumanism.
That's the transhumanism thing, right?
One thing I'd like to mention too is about this topic is we can't forget the fact that there's a bit of a cultural aspect and free will aspect, because remember the sort of super elite kind of people who are dreaming of this future that they want to create, they first off suppose that the future needs to be created, and it needs to be created by them. And that's important to note, because if you look at as someone who's in Russia, if you look at a lot of like sort of Russian sci-fi or sci-fi from Russian-speaking people, there's this recent series of these sort of like promotional videos from this company, and they made basically a sort of like what a Russian colonization of Mars would look like. And it was sort of ironic because it's exactly the same thing as some kind of dinky Russian village here, but just on Mars, right? Or if you look at like the game Stalker, which is about that's a big one. But essentially, what it kind of winds up is, even though they're battling against this sort of like hive mind that's able to grant wishes somewhere, still they're kind of just sitting around these camps with guitars eating bologna. Bologna's very popular in Russia. So in a lot of ways, if you go to the east, be it Russia or be it China, there really isn't, no one sees this need. The future doesn't need to be manufactured, whether people live or die, how much of this are. Why does this all have to be manufactured? There's really no necessity to it. And I think that that's one problem with the Western mindset, is I think that that's something inherent within these people, is that they feel like they have to do something when literally everyone would be happier if they did nothing. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think the whole trajectory of our conversation just sums up how much people, we're basically talking about, we started off talking about lockdowns in Austria and, the vaccine mandates, and the conversation has gone on to transhumanism and the future of the human race. And I think that's really why there's so much, you talk about vaccine hesitancies, because there is so much technology, negative technology, the ability to do certain things. Nanoparticles that could possibly be, nobody knows, it's a conspiracy theory right now, but nanoparticles that could be placed in food and aerosols, even in, if they wanted to, if somebody wanted to, vaccines. So you have this question mark in a lot of people's minds, and that's where this whole hesitancy is coming from, and that's where and I'm wondering now if they expected this type of, the world leaders, if they expected this type of pushback that they're getting. I think maybe they thought that just screaming fire in a theater, screaming virus in a theater would get everybody lining up and to roll up their sleeves, and that's not happening. And doesn't mean people are anti-vax. I don't think that's the right way to look at it, to say that everybody's against these mandates and everything, but there's just a lot of doubt out there about the future of the planet and where we're heading, and people are really worried about the capabilities that the elite do have now and what their true agenda is. And let's face it, governments in the past, if they really cared about people, they'd be fighting obesity. They wouldn't have let the opioid epidemic run the course that it did. They'd be doing more to prevent people dying in their cars. But all of a sudden, they care so much about us. They care so much that they want to give everybody a vaccine. So what is the truth?
Well, and I think this is a good point where maybe we should end it here, because I think Robert sort of summed it up, that it all interconnects, because we can't forget that just at the basis, we often talk about geopolitics, and geopolitics is the fact that like Polish history is influenced by the fact that it's a flat plane between Western Europe and between Russian civilization. And that's why things happen there the way they do. So it's kind of the same thing with this topic, where a lot of things do interrelate, and that's what makes things difficult, and why I really hate when people always try to find one single solution to a problem or one sort of single angle, because there's always a lot of it. Always a lot. Anyways, Joaquin, let's give you the final word here today.
You know what? I just look at the situation in Austria, and I hope that it I hope that it blows up in their face. I think it's an awful, awful move in the direction of outright dictatorship. All of this process has been, by the way, but this is definitely taking things in the direction of New Zealand, and it cannot happen in Europe. Now it's like contagious from the A5. It's getting worse now in the Eurozone countries. And but I think that unlike in the Anglo-5 countries, I think Europeans have more fight in them. I think we've seen that already. So I'm encouraging people to evaluate things, think for themselves, and to remember that that governments serve people. People don't serve governments.